Rain is still dripping off his coat when he walks through the door, and for 10 years, the man waiting on that couch has only ever called himself a friend. Tonight, something in him shifts. He doesn't ask where the mark on her collar came from. He simply reaches out and scrubs it away, hard enough to leave the skin raw, like erasing evidence no one else was ever meant to find. There's no shouting, no accusation, just a silence so controlled it's almost worse than rage. Behind every locked door, every perfectly plated breakfast, every "I'm just looking out for you," something has been watching, counting, keeping score for a decade. What exactly has he been protecting all this time, and what is he willing to destroy to keep it? Pull up a seat, because what begins as a quiet apartment on a rainy night is about to unravel into the most possessive, all-consuming love story you'll watch all week. If you've ever had someone in your life who loved you a little too closely, a little too carefully, tell us about it in the comments. We have a feeling you'll see more of yourself in this one than you'd expect. Rain came down over Manhattan in long gray sheets, turning the neon signs along the avenue into smears of color on the wet asphalt. 29 floors up. In a Tribeca penthouse that cost more than most people's lifetime earnings, the apartment was quiet enough that Julian Cole could hear the second hand of the wall clock ticking through its rounds. He sat on the black leather sofa with his laptop open, a candlestick chart glowing on the screen, though if anyone had asked him to explain the numbers in front of him, he would not have been able to. His mind wasn't on the market, it wasn't the door. At 11 o'clock exactly, a key scraped into the lock, and the sound cracked the apartment's dense silence like a dropped glass. A young man stepped inside, soaked to the shoulders, his face pale from the cold. This was Milo Hart, Julian's closest friend since they were boys, the only person who still called him by his first name without flinching. Milo looked up and met Julian's eyes. There was something in that stare that felt colder than the storm outside. Julian didn't stand. He closed the laptop slowly, and his voice, low and even, cut through the room. "You're late." Milo startled, and the bag on his shoulder nearly slipped to the floor. He forced a smile. "Office threw together a last-minute thing for a client. I couldn't exactly walk out." Julian rose and crossed the room in a few unhurried strides. Each footstep landed like a small verdict, and Milo felt his own heartbeat pick up to match it. When there was barely a foot of space left between them, Julian lifted his hand. Not to catch the bag sliding off Milo's shoulder, but to brush, almost idly, at a wilted rose petal still clinging to the fabric near his collar. His fingers grazed skin gone cold from the rain, and Milo flinched back on instinct. Julian's eyes narrowed. He'd found something else, a faint reddish smear near the collar of Milo's white dress shirt. Lipstick. Small, faded, nothing that should have mattered, but to Julian it read like an open wound. The silence stretched long enough to hurt. Julian said nothing more. He simply reached into his pocket, drew out a folded handkerchief, and scrubbed at the mark, hard enough that by the time he stopped, the skin beneath was raw and red. The sting brought Milo fully back to himself. He pushed at Julian's hand, but it didn't move. It might as well have been forged from the same steel as the building's frame. There was nothing calm left in Julian's expression now, just a thin red thread behind his eyes, and beneath the mask of concern, something closer to hunger. He leaned in until his mouth was almost at Milo's ear. His breath was warm, his voice was not. "Don't let something that filthy touch you again." A chill ran down Milo's spine, not from the cold, but from something older, more animal. This was not the gentle friend who had shielded him for a decade. This was a stranger, dangerous in a way Milo had no name for, trying to control the very air he breathed. Julian let go. He dropped the stained handkerchief into the trash with something close to contempt, turned, and walked into the bedroom, leaving Milo alone in the middle of the vast, silent living room. Milo looked down at his own trembling hands and felt an invisible cord tightening slowly around his throat. Outside, lightning split the sky, throwing his solitary reflection across the window glass. The first frame in a story that had no way back. He stood there long after the bedroom door had clicked shut, listening to his own pulse in his ears. 10 years, he thought. 10 years of Julian showing up at every college orientation, every hospital visit, every holiday that would otherwise have been unbearably empty, and never, not once until tonight, had that devotion curdled into something with teeth. Milo told himself it was the rain, the late hour, the stress of whatever deal Julian was closing this quarter. He told himself a lot of things, standing there in his wet clothes with his neck stinging, and none of them were quite enough to explain the look that had been in Julian's eyes. That particular, focused stillness, like something deciding whether or not to let go of what it was holding. He went to bed without eating, and lay awake a long time listening for footsteps that never came, trying and failing to decide whether what he'd felt, underneath the fear, had actually frightened him. Morning brought only a thin, tired light, nothing that could soften the tension left over in the apartment. Julian had gone early, leaving behind a breakfast that was flawless in presentation and cold in every other way. Milo looked at the plate of perfectly poached eggs and felt his throat close. He couldn't manage a bite. He gathered his things in a hurry. No time now to think through what had happened the night before, only the familiar, almost welcome pull of somewhere else to be, and headed for the architecture firm where he was still trying, after all these years, to prove he was someone in his own right and not just an extension of someone else's name. Milo was soft-spoken by nature, a little shy, but fiercely serious about the one thing that was entirely his: design and the particular joy of turning a blank page into a livable space. Behind that quiet exterior, though, was a wound that had never fully closed. He and Julian had grown up 2 doors apart, in the kind of pre-war building where children learned each other's families before they learned each other's last names, and for the first 16 years of his life, Julian had simply been the older boy down the hall, sharper, quieter, a little unreachable, but always, in his own remote way, looking out for him. Then, when Milo was 17, a car accident took both his parents on a rain-slicked highway outside the city, leaving him alone in a swirl of gossip and greedy relatives, circling what little the family had left. It was in the wreckage of that life that the boy down the hall stopped being just a neighbor and became something closer to a wall between Milo and the world. Not quite a savior, but close enough that Milo had never questioned it. Julian, barely more than a teenager himself, but already the sole heir apparent to a fortune he hadn't asked for, had taken him in, built a fortress of money and protection around him, and called it a home. What had been an easy, ordinary childhood friendship hardened, almost overnight, into something Milo no longer had the vocabulary to name. Gratitude and dependency and love all folded together so tightly that by the time he was old enough to try to separate them, it was already too late. The firm, Meridian Architecture, was known for brutal hours, but Milo loved the noise of it, because it was the only place that let him forget, for a few hours, the sense of being watched. And yet no matter where he went, Julian's presence seemed to follow him like a second shadow. Julian was now CEO of Colin Ward, a financial empire with its name on 3 buildings downtown. He was known across the industry as decisive, cold, and, when it served him, ruthless. Everyone admired the closeness between the 2 men, called it the kind of brotherhood you didn't see anymore, the kind old money liked to talk about at dinner parties. Only Milo knew that whatever Julian's devotion had once been, it had long since curdled into something closer to a leash. Julian tracked what Milo ate, what he wore, who he spoke to. Every night, he went through Milo's call log and messages, always with the same explanation, that Milo was too trusting, too easy for someone cruel to take advantage of. He still heard from his mother's side of the family now and then. An aunt who called on his birthday only to ask, carefully, whether he'd consider helping out with a cousin's tuition. An uncle who'd once shown up at the old apartment before Julian moved him out, demanding to know why a 17-year-old orphan needed a lawyer of his own. Milo had learned early exactly what he was worth to them, and it wasn't sentiment. He kept his distance the way you'd keep your distance from a fire you already knew the shape of, and told himself that was simply what family meant for people like him now. A threat you managed, rather than a comfort you leaned on. The memory of the lipstick stain was still raw in Milo's mind. He knew Julian was angry, and Julian's anger was always worse in its silences than in its words. His desk sat by the window on the 14th floor, and on good days he could lose whole hours there without noticing, pencil scratching against vellum, the noise of the trading floors and gossip and everything else falling away. His supervisor, a sharp, kind woman named Priya Anand, had told him more than once that his instincts for how people actually moved through a space were better than architects twice his age, that he saw rooms the way most people only saw furniture. It was one of the only places in his life where he felt like himself instead of like an appendage of the Cole name, and he guarded those hours jealously, the way other people guarded sleep. He was halfway through a section drawing for a new downtown retail complex when his phone buzzed. A text from Julian, only a few words, telling him to leave the office early. Julian would swing by to take him to a launch party for an important new client. Milo let out a slow breath. He didn't have the right to say no. He told himself, as he always did, that Julian only acted this way out of love, that Julian was the last person left in the world who was truly his. But there were days that love felt like it was choking him, like a bird raised in a gilded cage, well-fed, well-kept, and never once told what the sky actually tasted like. He stood at the office window, watching the traffic crawl below, and touched the still reddened skin at his collar. Somewhere underneath all of it, he wanted quietly and desperately to open up to someone, anyone, and live an ordinary life. But the shadows of the past, and the weight of everything Julian had given him, stood like a fortress wall against the idea of ever walking away. He owed Julian too much, his life, arguably his future, so he chose to endure it, chose to be the obedient companion at the side of a lonely private emperor. He never once suspected that his own quiet compliance was feeding something dangerous in Julian, a thing that grew larger by the day, ready to swallow him whole the moment he ever tried to step outside the lines Julian had drawn. The launch party was held on the top floor of a glass tower overlooking the Hudson, the whole skyline glittering below like something poured from a jewelry box. Milo wore a tailored navy suit and walked in beside Julian, who, in unrelieved black, was, as usual, the center of every eye in the room. Surrounded by financiers and city officials, Milo always felt slightly out of place, but Julian had a habit of resting a hand at the small of his back, a quiet, wordless claim staked in front of the entire room. That confidence faltered, just slightly, when a younger man with windburned good looks and an easy, disarming smile approached them. This was Derek Voss, a gifted architect freshly back from a few years in Rome, and, as it happened, the lead on the very project Milo had been working on. Milo's eyes went wide. He hadn't expected to see Derek here, let alone learn that he was also the son of the chairman of the firm hosting the party. Derek recognized Milo immediately, smiled, shook his hand, and complimented the section drawing Milo had finished that same afternoon. There was an openness to Derek that put Milo instantly at ease. For the first time all evening, he found himself talking shop with real enthusiasm, his eyes lighting up in a way Julian rarely got to see. Julian stood beside them, his gaze narrowing to something dangerous. He watched Derek's hand rest briefly on Milo's shoulder and felt something like a lit fuse burning through his chest. He said nothing, but the temperature of the air around him dropped several degrees, enough that the people nearby quietly found reasons to step away. Derek, seemingly oblivious to the tension, turned to Julian with a needling little grin. "Didn't realize you'd been hiding talent like this," he said. Julian answered with a smile that never touched his eyes. He drew Milo in closer, his voice dropping into something low and edged with warning. Milo isn't someone just anyone gets to look at. The possessiveness in the line landed like slap. Milo dipped his head, avoiding Derek's curious glance. What had, moments ago, looked like a straightforward professional connection now looked, in Julian's eyes, like a direct threat to the private kingdom he'd spent a decade building around Milo. For the rest of the night, Julian didn't leave his side, using nothing but a cold stare to turn away anyone who so much as drifted near. When Derek came back around to offer Milo a glass of wine, Julian declined on his behalf, citing a headache Milo didn't have. For a few minutes, watching Milo laugh over some detail of the Rome renovation Derek was describing, Julian found himself doing the math on how long it had been since he'd made Milo laugh like that himself. Freely, without effort, without either of them performing for a room. He couldn't remember. The realization sat in his chest like a stone the rest of the night. The ride home, in the back of Julian's car, was quiet in a way that felt dangerous. Milo stared out the window, Derek's easy smile and the sense of freedom he represented still lingering in his mind. Then, without warning, Julian spoke, his voice cold enough to cut. He told Milo that starting tomorrow, he wasn't to work on Derek's project anymore. Milo turned sharply, disbelief plain on his face. He didn't understand why Julian felt entitled to reach that far into his career. He opened his mouth to object, and Julian reached over and caught his chin, forcing Milo to look at him. His voice dropped low. "You only need to be near me. Everyone else is a liability." Milo's resistance lasted exactly one night. The next morning, his department head called him in, visibly uncomfortable, and informed him he'd been reassigned to logistics support on an unrelated internal project, effectively cut loose from Derek's team entirely. Milo stood frozen in the middle of the office, humiliation and helplessness rising in his chest. He thought, briefly and uselessly, of arguing the decision through official channels, before remembering that there were no channels at Meridian, or anywhere else in his life, that ultimately answered to anyone but the Cole family's money. He already knew, with total certainty, who was behind it. Julian wasn't content to control his private life anymore. Now he was strangling the career Milo had worked years to build. Whatever this was, it wasn't protection anymore. It was captivity wearing the mask of friendship. Julian wasn't finished. That same afternoon, as Milo packed up his desk, Julian appeared in the lobby of the firm alongside Derek's father, the chairman of the partner company. After a brief, calculated exchange, Julian casually announced a piece of news that landed like a small earthquake. To strengthen the strategic partnership, Cole and Ward would be sending a specialist to oversee progress on Derek's project directly. That specialist, of course, was Milo. The catch was that Milo would need to relocate into a company-owned unit near the office tower, for convenience, so he could put in extra hours as Julian's special assistant. It was, in truth, an elegant piece of engineering, a way for Julian to keep Milo under constant watch, while making the arrangement look, on paper, entirely reasonable. Milo, cornered, had no real way to refuse. He was made to pack up and move that same night. The new apartment was smaller than Julian's, but fully furnished and equipped with an unusually dense security camera system. What Milo found particularly hard to swallow was that Julian kept a spare key and could let himself in whenever he liked. The two of them were locked into a relationship that blurred professional and personal, with almost no room to breathe. 12 hours a day together at the office, and the rest of the evening spent with Julian showing up under the banner of concerned friend, checking whether Milo had eaten on time. Even with resentment and helplessness churning underneath, Milo found himself spending more time in Julian's orbit than ever before. Every morning, Julian drove him to work personally. In the close quarters of the car, the familiar scent of cedar and leather that always clung to him wrapped around Milo until it felt like he was slowly being absorbed into Julian's world. Julian began handing him thick stacks of reports, asking for summaries each night. Framed as a chance to learn management, though really it was just one more way to make sure Milo had no free hours left to think about anyone else, Derek especially. Little by little, Julian's presence stopped feeling like an event and became something closer to weather, a bond that was equal parts tender and merciless, one Milo couldn't find a way to break. He noticed that no matter how far he tried to run, every road seemed to circle back to the same cold, controlled man holding the key to the cage of his own life. And yet, buried inside the suffocating routines and unspoken rules, small collisions kept happening, tiny shifts that quietly rearranged the rhythm of both their hearts. However cold and controlling Julian could be, the attention he paid Milo was, in its own way, almost frighteningly precise. Some nights, while Milo sat hunched over his drafting table under warm desk light, Julian would silently set down a glass of warm milk or a cup of chamomile tea, say nothing, and simply stand there a while, watching the thin line of his back before walking away. The gestures repeated often enough that Milo, however much he wanted to resent them, couldn't quite deny the warmth seeping into a heart that had spent 10 years mostly alone. On the nights Milo fell asleep face down over his papers, it was Julian who carried him to bed, carefully removing his glasses, tucking the blanket around him with a gentleness that looked more like someone handling something breakable and precious than anything else. In the dark, Julian would sometimes sit at the edge of the bed for a long while, tracing a fingertip lightly along the line of Milo's face, from his brow to the soft press of his lips in sleep. His possessiveness in these moments wasn't a storm anymore. It was closer to an undertow, quiet but relentless. In the mornings, Milo always woke to find himself neatly arranged in bed, and a short text waiting on his phone, "Gone to work, remember to eat breakfast." These late-night and early morning messages became a kind of habit, a quiet channel of connection that needed almost no words at all. That closeness showed up, too, in small unguarded moments at the office. In tense meetings with difficult clients, when Milo felt himself losing his footing under a hard question, It took nothing more than a steadying look from Julian, or a light touch on the back of his hand under the table, to bring him back to solid ground. Once, hunched together over a set of blueprints, the space between them closed until Milo could feel the warmth radiating off Julian's body. He glanced up and caught Julian's eyes already on him, not on the drawings at all. The look was so deep, so full of something dense and unspoken, that Milo had to duck his head, his heart skipping. There was, too, a strange comfort in how well Julian knew the shape of Milo's grief, even when he never spoke of it directly. On the anniversary of the accident, Milo always woke to find the apartment quieter than usual. No reports waiting on the table, no summons to any event. Julian simply gave him the day, without ever once naming what the day was, and left a single white lily on the kitchen counter where Milo would find it alone. It was the one date of the year Julian never tried to fill with rules or routines, as if some part of him understood that possession had its limits, that there were rooms in Milo he wasn't entitled to walk into uninvited, even now. The closer they got, the more Milo found himself noticing Julian's habits, the way his brow furrowed at coffee that was too bitter, the way he loosened his tie the second exhaustion set in. Details he'd never once cared about before now sat vividly in his memory. Beneath the fear of being controlled, something else, a dependency, quiet and dangerous, was starting to take root. He caught himself feeling hollow on nights he didn't hear Julian's car pull up outside, or didn't get one of those clipped, dry check-in texts. He still wasn't ready to admit it, not even to himself, but the thread between them had stopped being simple friendship or guardianship a while ago. It had turned into something warmer, smoldering just under a shell of ice, waiting for a spark to catch. That quiet intimacy was finally tested one evening after a long shift, when Julian took Milo to a nice restaurant for dinner. While Julian stepped away to take a call from a client, Milo ran into an old college friend, and the two of them fell into easy conversation. At one point, laughing at something, the friend rested a hand briefly on top of Milo's. Nothing more than habit, nothing meant by it. Julian saw it the second he returned. He didn't erupt. But the thin, flat smile on his mouth made something in Milo go cold. In the car afterward, the small space felt suffocating. Julian abruptly pulled over, turned, and looked at Milo with a jealousy he made no effort to hide. His voice came out low and rough as he asked whether Milo simply preferred the touch of strangers to his. The accusation was so unfair, so heavy, that Milo froze. He felt insulted, and beneath the insult, something confusing stirred. He shot back that it had just been an old friend, that Julian had no right to police his most basic interactions. Julian didn't back down. He leaned in until their faces were almost touching, his eyes locked on Milo's trembling mouth, his breath hot against Milo's skin, scrambling every thought in his head. In a moment that felt like it slipped past his own control, Julian muttered that he couldn't stand the sight of anyone else touching him, because every inch of him had belonged to Julian for a long time now. The words landed like a confession stripped bare, reaching far past the borders of friendship or ordinary possessiveness. Milo went still, his heart pounding so hard it hurt. One overstepped sentence, one look that had cut straight through to something underneath, and suddenly he had to ask himself the question he'd been avoiding for months. Does he actually want me? Am I actually falling for this? For him? He realized, with a kind of dread, that he didn't feel disgust. What he felt underneath the shock was something closer to a quiet, guilty satisfaction. The silence that followed wasn't the usual cold quiet between them. It was charged, thick with something neither of them could name. Milo turned to face the window, hiding the heat rushing to his face, while Julian's knuckles went white around the steering wheel. Neither of them slept that night. Milo lay in his new apartment staring at the ceiling, replaying the look on Julian's face in the car. His jealousy hadn't looked like a friend being overprotective. It had looked like a man losing his mind at the thought of losing the one thing he couldn't live without. Milo wondered if he was walking straight into something dangerous, a game where he was the only one who didn't know the rules. Across the way, in his own apartment, Julian stood on the balcony, staring at the light still on in Milo's window. He knew he'd gone too far. He also knew, at this point, that there was no controlling the thing growing in his chest. A crooked kind of love had already taken root, and tonight's misstep had only fed it. The questions neither of them had answered got swept aside a few days later by something neither had seen coming. Late one afternoon, while Milo was out at a job site on the edge of the city, checking figures alone ahead of a big presentation, a storm rolled in without warning. The sky went dark in minutes. Rain and wind tore across the yard, throwing the site into chaos. Milo, scrambling to gather his drawings, slipped on the wet ground and went down hard, his ankle twisting under him. His phone slid into a puddle and died instantly. Alone in the dark, with the storm howling around him, Milo curled up under a half-collapsed tarp, shaking with cold and fear. At his lowest point, a flashlight beam cut through the rain, and Julian's voice, hoarse, frantic, called out somewhere close. He'd walked out of an important board meeting the moment he noticed Milo's location hadn't moved in 2 hours. When he found Milo sitting soaked and pale on the ground, he crossed the distance like something fired from a bow. He didn't scold him. He tore off his own coat, wrapped it around Milo's shaking frame, lifted him bodily off the ground, and carried him through the mud to the cab of a site pickup truck. Inside, in the small, warm space, Julian dried the rain off Milo's face with a towel, his hands gentle enough to bring Milo close to tears. The road back into the city had partially washed out, so the two of them were forced to wait out the night in the site's small brake trailer. Julian lit a candle, knelt down, and carefully examined the injury to Milo's ankle. Watching a man who was usually so fastidious kneel unbothered in mud to nurse his injury, Milo felt something in his chest give way, an intimacy neither of them had let themselves feel before. When Milo winced at the pain, Julian looked up sharply, resting a palm against his cheek, the warmth of it flooding through him like something medicinal. He murmured, almost accusing, that Milo had no idea how much he made him worry. In the quiet of that little trailer, with nothing but rain drumming on the roof, Milo felt the distance between them close in a way it never had before. He no longer saw the controlling man from before, only someone giving everything he had to keep another person safe from the storm. Without thinking, he let his head rest against Julian's shoulder, breathing in cedar mixed with rain, feeling, for the first time in a long while, completely safe. Julian didn't pull away. He wrapped an arm around Milo's thin shoulders and held him gently, as if to promise that whatever happened next, he wouldn't have to face it alone. Julian reached out and tucked back a damp strand of hair from Milo's forehead. He didn't move his hand away, just let it rest against Milo's cheek, his thumb tracing a slow line across his skin. His voice dropped, all the usual command gone out of it, replaced by something closer to a quiet plea. "You're safe," he said. "I'm right here. Nothing's going to hurt you again." The simplicity of it broke through the last of Milo's defenses. Before he could answer, Julian pulled him into a tight embrace. Not rough, not possessive the way it had been before, but something closer to shelter, as if he wanted to fold Milo entirely into his chest and keep the whole world out. Outside, the storm had eased into a steadier, quieter rain, tapping against the trailer's tin roof like something almost gentle now. The single candle guttered on the table, throwing long shadows across the cramped little room, across the 2 cots no one was using, across the mud still drying on both their clothes. None of it mattered. Milo froze for a moment, his heart hammering loud enough that he was sure Julian could feel it against his own. He could feel the strong, steady beat of Julian's heart against his back, warm and unmistakably real. It was the first time Julian had ever crossed the line between friends, this openly, this directly. Instead of pulling back the way he always had, Milo reached up without meaning to and caught a fistful of Julian's shirt, resting his chin against his shoulder. A faint, involuntary smile touched his lips. Whatever fear he still carried about being possessed by this man, in a moment this close to danger, this was still the only place he wanted to be. Julian felt him lean in and tightened his arms just slightly, his breath warm against the curve of Milo's neck. He murmured a confession, quiet but weighted. "Don't ever get that far from me again." Milo's answer was silence, but not the anxious kind. Something in the air between them thickened, turned warm. A small, near-whispered "I know" slipped out of him, quiet as a moth's wing, and it was enough to make Julian feel, for one unguarded second, like his entire world had just been made whole. It wasn't only an embrace. It was an unspoken promise, marking the biggest turning point their relationship had ever had, the point where the shell of friendship finally cracked open to reveal something deeper and far more complicated underneath. The fragile happiness of that night didn't last. A week after the storm, while Julian was tied up in back-to-back board meetings, an unmarked package arrived at Milo's office. Inside were old photographs and yellowed legal documents. What Milo found inside made his world come apart at the seams. They were investigation records from the accident that had killed his parents. Buried among the dry legal language was a name he recognized instantly: Julian's father, the previous chairman of Colin Ward, listed as the driver who had caused the collision. He had used money and influence to erase the truth, turning it into an accident with no clear cause. The bare fact of it left Milo shaking so badly he could barely stand. Everything, the decade of protection, the guardianship, the devotion, reframed itself instantly as something closer to guilt money. He felt suddenly like a puppet who had spent 10 years mistaking a cage for a kindness. Worse still was what he found folded inside the same envelope: a private agreement between Julian and Milo's own greedy relatives, arranging for Julian to buy full guardianship of him the moment the funeral was over. Every choice in Milo's life since, which school, which job, which apartment, had been quietly engineered to keep him within reach of the Cole family. When Julian came home that evening with flowers, ready to celebrate the new project, he found Milo standing in the middle of the living room instead, eyes red-rimmed, papers scattered at his feet. Milo looked at him with a mixture of disgust and devastation, the exact look Julian had spent years dreading. His voice broke as he asked whether all of it had been a lie. Had Julian only ever cared for him to quiet his own family's rotten conscience? For a moment Julian looked almost relieved, as if some part of him had been waiting 10 years for exactly this, for the lie to finally collapse under its own weight, so he wouldn't have to be the one to bring it down. But relief curdled fast into something closer to grief when he saw what was actually written on Milo's face. This wasn't the release he'd secretly hoped for. It was the beginning of losing him. Julian's silence was its own answer. He didn't deny it, just bowed his head over the old photographs, his usually unreadable face open, for once, with something like guilt, though not without a hard edge of stubbornness underneath. The betrayal cut deep enough that Milo felt undone by the one person he had trusted completely. He realized, with a sick kind of clarity, that Julian's possessiveness had always been a rope woven out of deception. The tighter it wrapped, the harder it was to breathe. No explanation could bridge the gap that had just opened between them. Milo stepped back out of Julian's reach, packed up what little he owned, and made the decision to walk out of his world entirely. Julian begged, insisted that whatever the truth of his family, his feelings for Milo were real. But all Milo could see was a fog too dark to see through. The distance between them yawned open like a canyon, pushing them to opposite shores, where every last thread of trust had come completely undone. After that night, Milo disappeared from Julian's life like smoke. He handed back the company apartment, cut off every line of contact, and quit the firm. He moved into an old walk-up buried down a narrow street on the far edge of the city. No glittering lights here, no trace of the wealth he'd been surrounded by for a decade. He lived quietly, taking whatever small design work he could find at a tiny studio just to get by. The separation was a bitter medicine he forced himself to swallow, in the hope that it might eventually heal something. He avoided the news, deleted his social media, tried to scrub every trace of Julian's name from his mind. But silence isn't the same thing as forgetting. He picked up shifts at the little studio wherever he could get them, mostly sketching renderings for other people's projects, his own ambitions quietly shelved for the time being. His new landlady, an older woman named Rosa, who ran the corner grocery below his apartment, took a liking to him without ever quite asking why a young man with such careful hands was living somewhere so far below what he was clearly used to. She left extra bread on his step some mornings and never mentioned it, and Milo never explained, and between the two of them an easy, undemanding kindness grew that asked nothing of him at all, which, after everything, was its own kind of relief. Every night, alone in his cramped, damp little room, Milo found himself sitting still, staring at nothing. He remembered cedarwood. He remembered the hands that had once bandaged his ankle in the rain, and the possessive, worried look in Julian's eyes. His heart tore itself in two, half hating what Julian's family had done, half aching from a decade's worth of attachment that refused to just die. He wanted to hate him. Instead, he found himself only in pain, missing him past all reason. Two men on opposite sides of the city, each locked in a prison of their own making. On Julian's side, his whole world had quietly collapsed the moment Milo left it. The commanding executive, The man the tabloids called untouchable now moved through his days like something hollowed out. He didn't chase Milo the way he might have before. He knew, this time, that showing up would only cut the wound deeper. Instead, he spent long stretches of time sitting in Milo's empty room, running his hands over the few things Milo had left behind. He didn't dare call. He didn't dare text. He didn't feel he'd earned the right to ask for forgiveness. All he allowed himself was to quietly have people watch over Milo from a distance, making sure he had enough to eat, enough to get by, without ever letting him know. Once he found himself standing across the street from Rose's grocery for the better part of an hour, just to watch Milo carry a bag of vegetables up the narrow staircase to his apartment, safe and upright and, as far as Julian could tell from that distance, unbroken. He left before Milo could look up and see him there. It was, he told himself, the least selfish thing he'd ever managed to do for the person he loved, and it still felt, every time, like losing something all over again. The silence between them dragged on like years. They barely spoke. In truth, they didn't speak at all, but the invisible thread between them never quite snapped. Every time Julian passed a shop that sold chamomile tea, he'd stop, almost without meaning to, and buy a bag, only to realize a beat too late that there was no one left to make it for. He kept the driver on retainer long after any reasonable person would have called it excessive, just in case, and told no one, not even his own assistant, why a man who could buy the whole block never seemed to walk down it. Milo had his own version of it. Sometimes, on a crowded street, he'd catch sight of a black car that looked like Julian's, and his heart would skip a beat before he caught himself. They were both hurting, both remembering, but pride and the wreckage of the past had built a wall neither one was willing to be the first to break. The quiet, aching rhythm of Milo's new life was torn open one late night on his way home from the studio. In a dark, empty alley near his building, a group of rough-looking men blocked his path. This wasn't a random mugging. They were collectors, sent by the same greedy relatives who'd once tried to profit off his parents' deaths. After Julian had cut off every dollar of support to that side of the family for leaking the past the way they had, the debts they owed elsewhere had piled up fast, and their fury landed, predictably, on Milo. They wanted him to sign over the last small piece of land his family had left, a plot he'd been holding on to, quietly, as the only physical memory of his parents. He recognized one of them, distantly, from a funeral 7 years gone, a cousin of his mother's, older now, harder around the eyes, the kind of face that had once cried politely over a casket and asked about the will before the flowers had wilted. That recognition, more than the threat itself, was what made Milo's hands shake as he refused. Whatever resistance an artist with no training in violence could offer, it wasn't enough against several grown men with nothing left to lose. He was shoved down hard onto the filthy pavement, his head cracking against a brick wall, his vision swimming. In that moment, in real pain and real terror, he thought, with a strange calm, that this might be where it ended. In some forgotten corner of the city no one would think to look. Just as one of the men drew back for a final blow, tires screamed at the mouth of the alley. Headlights swept the scene, blinding everyone. A tall figure moved out of the light and into the fight like something unleashed. Julian had arrived. In truth, he had never once stopped watching. Even after promising Milo his space, his instincts, protective, possessive, impossible to fully rein in, had kept a quiet security detail trailing Milo from a distance the entire time. The moment word of the attack reached him, he'd taken the wheel himself and run every red light in the city to get there. There was nothing left of the composed executive in him now. He tore into the two largest men with a handful of brutal, precise blows, his eyes blazing with a fury that sent the rest of the group scattering. He didn't bother chasing them down. He dropped to his knees beside Milo instead, hands shaking as he cradled his bloodied, bruised face. Milo, exhausted, let his head fall against Julian's chest, breathing in the cedar and rain-damp warmth that still, somehow, meant safety. He was still angry. He was still hurting. But in a moment this close to death, Julian's presence was the one thing keeping him tethered to being alive at all. Julian wept. Tears, hot, real, unfamiliar, on a face that had spent years perfecting its own coldness, fell onto Milo's pale cheek. He kept murmuring apologies, over and over, swearing that no one would ever lay a hand on him again, whatever it cost him. He made the decision, right there, to act, fully aware Milo might hate him even more for the interference. He lifted him off the ground and carried him to the car, bypassing the public hospital entirely to avoid any press, and drove straight to his own estate, where a private physician was already waiting, ready for whatever came next, whatever it took to keep the person he loved safe. The house settled into a deep, late-night stillness, broken only by the steady tick of a clock and the thin, uneven sound of Milo's breathing from the bed. When the fever finally broke, Milo opened his eyes slowly to find himself in a bedroom that was both achingly familiar and strange. Julian sat beside the bed, eyes sunken from lack of sleep, his shirt still marked with dried blood from the fight the night before. Seeing Milo wake, Julian reached out instinctively, then stopped himself mid-motion, hand hanging in the air, afraid that any touch now might only push Milo further away. The silence held for a long time before Julian finally broke it, his voice rough and low. He said he would explain everything, and after that, if Milo wanted to leave, he wouldn't stop him. Julian began to speak, laying out everything he had kept buried for so long. He admitted he'd known about the accident for 10 years, but at the time he'd been a powerless teenager standing in the shadow of his father's authority, with no way to fight it. He said he'd spent the rest of his youth clawing his way to the top of the company, not for the title, not for the name on the door, but so that he'd finally have enough power to shield Milo from his own family's ghosts. "I was afraid," Julian said, head bowed, hands curled into fists. "I was afraid that if you ever found out, you'd look at me the way you'd look at something monstrous. There was a selfish part of me that wanted to keep you inside that lie forever, just so I could wake up every morning and still see you smile at me." The rawness of the confession left Milo stunned. He had spent 10 years assuming Julian's coldness was simply his nature, the temperature at which powerful men were built. It had never once occurred to him that underneath it was a boy who had watched his own father erase a family's grief with a signature and a check, and had spent every year since trying to build himself into someone strong enough that it could never happen again to anyone he loved. Beneath the armor of total control Julian had built around him for a decade, there was nothing but fear of losing the one person he couldn't live without. That night, Julian didn't leave his side. He stayed up changing cool compresses on Milo's forehead, patiently feeding him small spoonfuls of broth when Milo was still too weak to hold the spoon himself. When Milo finally broke down, crying from exhaustion and pain and everything else he'd been holding in, Julian simply held him, let him cry it all out against his chest, saying nothing, offering no polished words, just the solid, steady weight of his shoulder to lean on. That patient, unglamorous care began slowly to soften something in Milo. He came to understand that whatever twisted shape Julian's love had taken, the devotion and sacrifice underneath it, across all those years, had been entirely real, undeniable even now. Forgiveness wasn't something that could happen all at once, but in the warm quiet of that room, the first small seed of real understanding had finally taken root. Milo looked down at Julian's scraped, battered hands and reached out to touch one of them gently. The first small act of opening he'd allowed himself since everything had fallen apart. He said he needed time, but he wasn't leaving. Not yet. Julian looked up at him, a fragile flicker of hope in his eyes. For the first time, they had said the things that mattered most out loud, and set down some of the weight of all that deception. The wounds of the past hadn't disappeared, but faced with real honesty and real remorse, Milo began, slowly, to understand that love was never only the easy, sunlit parts. It was also learning to hold space for the darkest corners of another person. He thought too about something Priya had said to him once, years earlier, when he'd tried to explain, badly, why he could never quite make plans without checking with someone else first. She'd told him that the people who loved you the right way made you bigger, not smaller, gave you more room in the world, not less. He hadn't understood it then, not really. He'd been too busy being grateful for the ceiling over his head to notice how small the room underneath it had become. Lying in Julian's guest room, with his ankle still wrapped, and his head still aching from the fall, listening to the unfamiliar quiet of a house with no one checking his phone, he thought he might, finally, be starting to. There was, too, a harder truth Milo had to sit with in the days that followed, one Julian never tried to talk him out of. Loving someone honestly didn't erase what his family had done, and it didn't put his parents back in the world. Forgiveness, Milo decided, wasn't something he owed Julian at all. If it came, it would have to come on its own schedule, built slowly out of 1,000 small proofs rather than one long night of confession. Julian seemed to understand this without being told. He stopped asking whether Milo had forgiven him. He simply kept showing up day after ordinary day and let the showing up speak for itself. After the storm of that confrontation, Julian and Milo's life together settled, slowly and strangely, into something like peace. Milo chose to stay at the estate to recover rather than return to the walk-up across town. This time, though, Julian didn't fall back on rules and restrictions to keep him close. Instead, the two of them began, together, to build new habits, small, ordinary things that the old possessiveness had never left room for. Every morning, instead of tense silence, they sat together on the terrace over cups of chamomile tea, the same tea Julian had always bought and never once had the chance to share, until now. Trust, it turned out, wasn't rebuilt with grand promises. It was built out of small, repeated, ordinary things. Milo picked his art back up, and Julian set aside an entire sunlit room in the house as a studio just for him. Some evenings, after a punishing day at the firm, instead of disappearing into his office, Julian would find his way to the studio instead, sitting quietly in a corner just to watch Milo sketch. Sometimes they walked together under the trees on the property as the sun went down, or sat listening to the same old instrumental records they'd both always loved. Something like a real two-person family began, at last, to take shape, not built on debt or obligation anymore, but on two people choosing, freely, to stay. Julian learned, slowly, to rein in his own jealousy. When Derek sent Milo an invitation to join a community design project, Julian, despite the flicker of old discomfort he still felt, set the letter on Milo's desk himself and told him the decision was entirely his to make. The shift stunned Milo and moved him more than he expected. He could see that Julian was genuinely trying to undo his own worst habits, trying to learn how to love someone through respect instead of ownership. In turn, Milo started paying closer attention to Julian's health, learning to cook the simple, nourishing meals Julian never made time for himself, reminding him to actually sleep. A quiet, warm circle of mutual care began to form between them. Some nights, when the weather was good, they cooked together instead of apart. Julian, oddly, was hopeless with a knife but stubbornly insistent on being useful, and Milo learned to let him ruin the garlic without saying anything about it. Because the wrecked garlic mattered less than the fact that Julian had chosen, unprompted, to stand there at the counter instead of retreating to his study the way he once would have. Little by little, these shared habits became the strongest thread holding them together, easing whatever pain still lingered from everything that had come before. They started taking on small projects together, Milo handling the design and feel of a space, Julian managing the numbers, and the ease with which they worked side by side made it clear that they had always, somehow, been two halves of the same whole. The ghosts of the past still visited some nights in dreams, but waking to find the other person right there beside them was each time proof enough that they had the strength to face it together. Trust built up out of the wreckage of deceit turned out to be sturdier and more precious than anything that had come before, laying the groundwork for a future where something real finally had room to bloom. There were setbacks too, small ones that kept the peace from feeling too easy. A late night when Julian, without thinking, asked who Milo had been texting, and caught himself only after the words were already out, the old reflex surfacing before he could stop it. He apologized immediately, plainly, without excuses, and Milo found that the apology itself, offered without being demanded, meant more than the mistake had cost him. There was an evening, too, when Milo, unprompted, told Julian exactly where he'd be and who he'd be with before Julian could even think to ask. An old habit of appeasement he had to consciously unlearn, piece, replacing it with the plainer, freer habit of simply living his life and trusting that Julian would let him. Love, they were both discovering, wasn't a single dramatic rescue. It was this, the unglamorous daily work of catching your own worst instincts before they hardened back into old shapes. That fragile piece was shaken to its foundations by a threat from within the Cole family itself. Word reached the board, and, worse, Julian's grandmother, that the heir to the Cole empire was living openly with the son of a man his own father had killed and covered up. Constance Cole, the steel-spined matriarch behind decades of the family's rise, would not tolerate a scandal like that touching the company's stock price or the family name. She summoned Julian back to the old family estate and delivered an ultimatum with no room for negotiation. Either he took Milo abroad, settled somewhere permanent, and severed every public tie between them, or she would use every media resource at her disposal to reopen the old accident. This time with fabricated evidence twisting it, so that Milo's own parents appeared to be the ones at fault, drunk behind the wheel. Julian was left staring down an impossible choice. If he chose to protect his relationship openly, defying his grandmother outright, the one thing Milo still had left, his parents' good name, the last piece of dignity from that whole tragedy, would be shredded by the machinery of the press. But if he gave in, he would end up trapping Milo in another kind of cage all over again, this time in some unfamiliar country, under the crushing weight of exile and family obligation. At almost the same moment, Milo received an unexpected offer of his own. A full scholarship to a prestigious art academy in Florence, the kind of opportunity he'd quietly dreamed about for years, back before he'd ever let himself believe his life might belong to him alone. Both of them suddenly were standing at their own separate crossroads, walk away from each other to protect themselves and their futures, or stand together and face the family's threat of total ruin. Julian came home that evening looking utterly worn down, and told Milo everything without holding anything back. He took Milo's hand, his voice shaking, and said he was ready to walk away from the company entirely, ready to give up every ounce of power and status he'd built, if it meant they could go somewhere, anywhere together. But Milo, looking into his eyes, saw the size of the sacrifice Julian was about to make, and couldn't let him make it. He didn't want their love turning into the very thing that cost Julian everything he'd worked his whole life to build. This final test wasn't only about his grandmother's disapproval, it was about whether the two of them had the courage to actually trust each other's strength. In the end, Milo made a bold call. Rather than run, he asked Julian to stand with him and face Constance directly. He said that for 10 years they had lived in the shadows of secrets and evasion, that it was finally time to walk into the light. Together, they built a plan to formally clear his parents' name, whatever damage that might do to Colin Ward's foundations. This time, they weren't choosing to weather the storm as a guardian and the one he protected. They were choosing it as two grown men, standing as equals. Milo's resolve gave Julian a strength he hadn't known he still had left in him. They both understood what waited behind that door, a storm of public backlash, the cold shoulder of society, the scorn of Julian's own family. But as long as their hands stayed locked together, there was no obstacle they couldn't face. The night before the meeting, neither of them slept much. They sat up at the kitchen table going over every document Julian had gathered, old financial transfers, a settlement letter, a private investigator's report he'd commissioned years ago and never had the courage to use. Milo read through his parents' names printed cold and official across page after page, and felt, for the first time since the package had arrived in his office, something closer to resolve than grief. He wasn't doing this to punish Julian's family, he realized. He was doing it so that somewhere, on some record that mattered, the truth about his mother and father would finally exist in black and white. Julian watched him work through it in silence, offering nothing but coffee, and once, a hand resting lightly over Milo's on the table. Not holding him back, just letting him know he wasn't doing it alone. Around 2 a.m, Milo finally set the last folder down and admitted, quietly, that he was afraid, not of Constance, not even of the press, but of finding out that when it came down to it, Julian's family would matter more to him than the truth. Julian didn't answer with reassurances. He simply slid every remaining document across the table toward Milo and told him to burn whichever ones he wanted gone, that the choice belonged entirely to him now, and had for a long time. Milo didn't burn any of them. He just needed, he realized, to hear that he could. The confrontation at the old Cole family estate took place on a late afternoon, the sky over the city bleeding red with sunset. In front of Constance and the assembled family board, Julian walked in holding Milo's hand, standing taller and more unshaken than anyone in that room had ever seen him. He hadn't come to beg forgiveness. He'd come to tell the truth. Constance Cole received them, in the same wood-paneled study, where she had presided over every difficult conversation in the family's history for the last 40 years, and she did not rise when they entered. She looked, for a long moment, at their joined hands before she looked at either of their faces, and something in her expression, Not quite approval, but not the flat refusal Julian had braced for either. Told him this would not go the way she had planned it in her own head either. It was Constance herself, in the end, who answered the one question that had sat unresolved between Julian and Milo for months, who had sent the package. She admitted it flatly, without apology, in the same tone she might have used to report a stock split. She had ordered an assistant to leak the file to Milo directly, months before the ultimatum, hoping the truth alone would do what she hadn't yet worked up the will to demand outright. That Milo would take one look at what the Cole family had done to his parents and remove himself from Julian's life without her ever having to say a word. It had been a test, and a cruel one, and it had very nearly worked. Milo absorbed this in silence, feeling something in his chest resettle into place. Not forgiveness, not yet, but at least the relief of no longer carrying an unanswered question alongside everything else. Backed by years of evidence Julian had quietly gathered on his own, and by Milo's own courage in standing there, facing the ghost of his past head-on, they forced the family to the negotiating table. Julian stepped down from his position as chairman, handing control of the company over to the board he had once answered to only in name, in exchange for the family's total silence and a settlement. A sum paid publicly and unmistakably into a charitable foundation established in the name of Milo's parents. The story of a golden heir walking away from wealth and power at the height of his career sent shockwaves through the financial press. But for Julian and Milo, it was, at long last, the moment they were actually free. They chose to leave the noise of the city behind entirely, moving down to a quiet coastal town in the south. There, together, they opened a small shop that doubled as an art studio and a tea room. Life, for the first time, had no more scheming, no more suffocating possessiveness, no more chains built out of deception. Each morning, Milo painted by the window overlooking the water, while Julian brewed tea nearby, occasionally crossing the room just to wrap his arms around him from behind. A hold that was gentle now, and full of respect, nothing like the grip of all those years before. One afternoon, when a sudden shower rolled in off the water, Milo was tidying an old bookshelf when he came across something folded flat inside an old notebook, a plain white handkerchief. It was the very same one Julian had once used to scrub a lipstick stain off his neck, that first rain-soaked night so many years ago, the exact moment his possessiveness had first shown its face, unguarded. Milo smiled and held it out to Julian. He took it, looked for a long moment at the faded stain still ghosted into the fabric, and pressed a soft kiss to Milo's forehead. Milo thought, watching him, of the lily that used to appear on the counter every year on a date neither of them ever said aloud, and understood finally that it had never really been about control at all, not underneath, not from the very beginning. It had only ever been fear wearing control's clothes, because fear was the one language Julian had been fluent in since he was barely more than a boy himself, powerless to stop his own father's car from ever having been on that road, and powerless, for years afterward, to do anything but keep the one person he loved as close as his own two hands could manage. Milo didn't say any of this out loud. He didn't need to. Some things, after enough years and enough forgiveness hard-won in small, unglamorous pieces, you simply learn to carry together instead of explaining. The handkerchief closed a circle neither of them had ever quite finished, a reminder of a beginning shaped by storms, but also of the strange, stubborn thread of fate that had bound them together in the first place. Their happiness now was as unremarkable and steady as the name of the little shop itself, Safe Harbor. There were still, now and then, curious looks from strangers, quiet gossip drifting in from somewhere far away, but when they looked at each other, they both knew, without any doubt, that they had chosen right. Julian was no longer the cold, dangerous force he'd once been in that world of glass towers and boardrooms, and Milo was no longer the frightened bird trapped up behind glass. They were, simply, two people who had walked each other through the worst of it and come out, together, somewhere close enough to grace. The old record player in the corner turned, and a wordless melody rose into the room, soft as the sound of the sea just outside the window. Sometimes, in the evenings, tourists would wander into the shop looking for postcards or a place to wait out the rain, and they'd find instead two men behind the counter, one pouring tea with the unhurried precision of someone who had once run a company worth billions, the other sketching the harbor from memory on the back of a paper napkin, and they'd leave without quite being able to say what it was about the place that made them want to come back the next day. Something in the quality of the quiet between the two men, maybe, that had nothing to do with the tea or the view, and everything to do with how long it had taken them both to earn it. Milo never did explain it to the curious ones who asked how a man like Julian ended up somewhere so small and so quiet. He only ever said that they'd needed the room to become people neither of them had been allowed to be before, and that the sea, as it turned out, had plenty of room to spare. On the anniversary of the night, they'd first met on the pier as boys, long before either of them understood what the other would come to mean. They closed the shop early and walked down to the water instead, the way they did every year now. Julian took Milo's hand as the tide came in around their ankles, cold and insistent, pulling small stones out from under their feet the way it had every year they'd stood there, and neither of them said very much. They didn't need to. The whole of it, the rain-soaked confrontation in a penthouse a lifetime ago, the surveillance and the jealousy, and the long, cold silence of the separation, and everything patient and ordinary that had been rebuilt since, sat quietly between them now, no longer a wound, just a shared history, carried the way the shoreline carries the tide, taken out, and always, eventually, brought back in. Somewhere behind them, up the sloped little street, the lights of Safe Harbor were still on, warm against the coming dark, waiting patiently for two men who were, for once in their long and complicated lives, in absolutely no hurry at all to get back. It closed, gently, on the story of a love that had once lost its way, and finally, after everything, found its way home. We want to know what hit you hardest in this one. The silence, the confession, or the moment the mask finally came off. Tell us in the comments. We genuinely read all of them. And if you want the next story waiting for you the moment it drops, hit subscribe and stay close.